How's it going, guys? It's Kass. As always, if you've been enjoying my content, then hit that subscribe button. In today's video, we're going to be finally talking about the Soulbinds. I was originally going to make this like a 4-part series going through all of the individual Soulbinds and talking about them, but then I slowly realized that that actually won't do much because realistically we're just going to be picking one, and one's just going to be generally stronger than the other two. So I'm going to go through my opinions on what I feel are the stronger ones for Demon Hunters specifically, and talk about those for you guys in this video today. So first we're going to start off with Kyrian, and for Kyrian we're probably going to be going Pelagos. Pelagos has been receiving some changes, so realistically there might be some more changes coming. Even right now, combat meditation doesn't show the number of mastery. I don't know if this is just a weird glitch with the Soulbind calculator, or if there's some changes going on, but that is something to look at just on the off chance things do get changed. So the first ability that we're going to be getting with the Soulbind is Combat Meditation. Basically how this works is whenever you use your class ability, it's going to give you an increase in your mastery for 10 seconds. And then over that 10-second window, it's going to expel sorrowful memories. These are basically like soul shards or soul fragments that'll spawn out of the enemy that you're actually hitting, and you'll just walk over them and it'll actually extend the combat meditation debuff. This can only happen once every 1 minute, and I want to make that clear. This is something that will be happening every time that you press the Covenant ability, but there is some randomness in how long you're actually going to have this debuff for. I'm not actually sure if there's any caps for it. There could be some crazy situations where you get a lot of procs, and some not so fun situations where you don't get any, and you only have it for 10 seconds. So that's something to think about, but realistically, it's a pretty good starting point. Then moving on, we go to our first potency conduit. When it comes to Demon Hunters specifically, we're going to be looking for potency conduits as one of the biggest places where we're going to be getting damage increases with Soulbind specifically. In this video, I'm not going to be talking about specific conduits or conduit choices. I already have a video all about potency conduits. The link that's going to be in the description. I would suggest watching that. That way you have an understanding of some of my thought process behind which potency conduits will actually be the go-to potency conduits. After that, when it comes to all of the Soulbinds, a lot of the situations that we're going to have is it's basically just going to be the top and bottom choice, and then the rest are just like filler small things that you get while you're getting to the different conduit access. For Pelagos specifically, after we go from our potency conduit, we have focusing mantra. This makes it so the cooldown of your File of Serenity is reduced by 1 second, so it gives you a little bit faster access to your files. Next, we'll be moving on to an endurance conduit. I've talked about this in the past as well. Realistically, all of the endurance conduits are pretty decent options. I don't think there's really like a choice that's like that bad versus the other choices. Whichever one you choose will probably be perfectly fine with you. Then we go into this row here. You can pick either one of these. It's not that big of a deal. Then we have the potency conduit, another endurance conduit, and then finally we have Let Go of the Past. Let Go of the Past is a pretty interesting Soulbind ability. It's okay, but it's not like that crazy. You're going to be getting 3% versatility at its max value, and that's going to be a constant buff as long as you don't press the same spell twice in a row. So this is basically the equivalent of like the hit combo that monks have, just a little bit lesser version of it, where all you have to do is press 3 buttons and then you're getting 3% versatility over the whole entire fight, as long as you do not repeat the same keystroke twice in a row. Versatility is one of those weird stats where some situations it feels really good, and then in other situations it feels like it's almost not even there. Having hybrid stats, it's always been kind of a weird situation for me. I don't really think they have a place in the game. In a lot of situations in the game, I would rather have them be 2 separate stats. Realistically, it is what it is, and Let Go of the Past is just a good option in general. Next, we're going to talk about the Necrolords. If you're playing a Demon Hunter in Shadowlands, I would suggest staying away from Necrolord. I think Blizzard as a whole hasn't really shown that they have a proper idea or focus on how they actually want to balance this talent. Originally, we were getting haste with this, which obviously as a Demon Hunter, haste is the one thing that you want the most. Now they've taken that away and made the damage increase a little bit longer. This kind of shows that they don't really have a focus on where they want to go with this. And I think it's been pretty evident in the development of Necrolord for Demon Hunter for a while now. They want to try and keep the idea of Father the Flame together, but they're slowly realizing that it's just probably never going to work unless it's just extremely overpowered. But on the off chance you're a masochist and want to even attempt to use that button, I would suggest going Emini. Emini gives you access to lead by example. Whenever you press Fire the Flame, you gain 5% agility, and then your nearby allies also gain 2% of their primary stat for 10 seconds. And then you, on top of that, you gain 5% additional agility up to 15%. So at the very start of pressing this button for a 10-second window, you're going to be having 20% increased agility. That's going to be a very good flat increase to your overall damage. The one issue I have with this though is that this isn't an instant thing. So you're going to be getting this debuff and using a portion of it to actually kill the demon that drops the pool for Father the Flame. So realistically, this 10 seconds is actually probably going to be like 8 or 7, depending on how fast you actually kill the demon. If you hit it in one hit, you still have to think about GCDs, you still have to think about potentially getting to the actual pool itself, potential pool animation time, all of these things that will be causing problems. Also, you're going to have to pick up the soul that it drops too. So if you get bad soul RNG, you could be in a situation where 3 seconds of this debuff is now gone, and then you still have to worry about potentially generating fury before you even get any access from it. And that's really some of the main issues with this that don't really make any sense, right? You shouldn't really have a talent that requires setup, but then also have a ability that augments the talent that is instant. And moving on from there, we have a potency conduit. Then we have another one of those situations where it's these choices in between the last choices don't really mean too much. Whenever you use Fleshcraft, it increases your maximum health by 5% for 30 seconds. Then we have a finesse conduit, which are basically useless for Demon Hunter. Then we have another option that you can choose either one. It doesn't really mean anything. Endurance conduit, potency conduit, and then finally we have gristled toes. Movement speed increased by 3% for every nearby enemy, up to 15%. As a Demon Hunter, we don't really need movement speed, but it's just what we get if we want a potency conduit. Now, this is one of these situations where there are some interesting potential trade-offs, depending on the power of potency conduits in general. This is going to be something that's going to take a lot of sims and a lot of just general character adjustment before we really understand the difference in power trade-offs between one soulbind or the other. So if potency conduits aren't really that much of a damage increase, then you could potentially be looking at going for another endurance conduit and then getting access to gnashing chompers. Gnashing chompers could be something that would feel actually really good in Mythic Plus specifically, or in like high ad boss fights. You gain 3% haste for 10 seconds after defeating an enemy, up to 15%. So this is going to be something that you're going to constantly be having after killing mobs, and 15% haste after killing 5 enemies in Mythic Plus will actually happen a decent amount of time. I'm not actually 100% sure how these debuffs work. If defeating an enemy increases and resets the time on the debuff, then it's actually incredibly strong. However, it's more likely that it's just right after you kill it, you get the 3% haste, and then it'll fall off after 10 seconds. Then the next thing you kill, you get another 3% haste, then that'll fall off after 10 seconds. And honestly, it's decisions like this that actually make this system a little bit more interactive than it actually was previously. It kind of sucks because obviously this is something that we'd love to have access to, but with the power of how I feel potency conduits will end up being versus what they're actually looking to do with these soulbinds, I don't think we're really going to ever use this ability. It almost feels like Blizzard's gotten to a point where they want soulbinds to be there, but they don't want soulbinds to be that impactful. But this is more about a way to give you access to potency conduits than anything else. I just want to reiterate here though that if you want to have a successful launch and a fun time playing Demon Hunter, I would personally suggest steering away from Necrolord. If you want to challenge yourself and potentially not have a spot in raid groups, then go ahead and try it. But Necrolord is in a very bizarre place, and I don't think they're going to get the love that they need for a very long time. Moving on from that, we're going to go to Venthyr. For Venthyr, it's basically just Nagia or bust. The starting power that she gets access to is Thrill Seeker. Thrill Seeker has been one of those things that's always been at the top of Demon Hunter's minds since the very beginning. It's just a lot of haste that we're getting. However, I don't really think it's going to be as dominant as people think that it will be, given the situations that we're getting haste. So how this buff actually works is you get a stack of Thrill Seeker every 2 seconds, or if you kill an enemy, you get 4 stacks. And then at 40 stacks, all of those stacks are consumed, and you get a buff that grants you 20% haste for 10 seconds. And then as you get out of combat, these stacks decay over time. This is a soulbind ability that's going to be fairly dominant in Mythic Plus whenever we have chain pulls. However, in situations in Mythic Plus where we have decent runs between packs, this may get to a situation where it's never actually hitting. And if you get a point to where this debuff or where this ticking buff resets after each pack, you're going to have to kill 10 mobs in that pack to get access to this buff. And the likelihood that we're killing 10 mobs in a pack and still have things to actually kill after we've killed 10 mobs isn't actually that high. There probably will be some pulls that are bigger pulls where you're killing smaller adds that will count towards the stacking buff, and then you have a larger ad that's still alive. However, the likelihood of those situations happening in Mythic Plus specifically aren't as high as you would think. Then when we're actually talking about the single target portion of this, we get a stack every 2 seconds. And then I'm not 100% sure how this function works, but I would assume that when you have Euphoria up, you no longer get Thrill Seeker stacks. But I might be wrong with that. I'm not 100% sure. And let's just go with the case that you're still getting Thrill Seeker stacks, even though Euphoria is currently on you. In that situation, you're only going to be getting this once every 80 seconds. When we think about the abilities that we have here that are modified by haste that we want to have the most possible haste in, those windows are obviously Metamorphosis. Those windows are obviously whenever we're pressing Sinful Brand, since dots are affected by haste, and also in situations where we're pressing I-Beam and getting into Demonic. And really the only situation that Thrill Seeker will be proccing and will be getting access to be able to use it in a single target situation is going to be lining it up with I-Beam specifically. And that's going to be something that you're going to want to do. Because if you're not lining this up with I-Beam, it's really not going to be a buff that you're going to feel all that much. It's just going to be in situations where you're doing the least amount of damage as a Demon Hunter, you get 20% haste, which could potentially make it feel a little bit better in those windows of less damage. But realistically, you would much rather this be an amp in a situation where you're doing a lot of damage. In most fights, we're going to be probably lusting on pull, especially if you're in pugs. And since that's the case, you're not going to have Thrill Seeker until a significant portion after that. We're lusting on pull, we're going to be meting on pull in most of those situations too, so you're never going to have Thrill Seeker for when you're actually pressing meta. When we think about Thrill Seeker realistically, it's more about the situation when it's overlapping with meta, and that's only going to happen when we get to our second meta. And that's also if we're pressing meta exactly off of cooldown, and we're not using meta for like ads or something like that in specific fights. There's a lot of scenarios where Thrill Seeker actually isn't going to have that much impact overall. So while I feel that it's obviously one of the strongest soulbinds we have access to, because obviously haste is the best thing that we can get, I actually don't see this as a build defining thing for Demon Hunter. If Sinful Brand wasn't the best option for single target, then realistically, I don't think we'd be taking Thrill Seeker just because of how good Thrill Seeker is. I hope that makes sense. After Thrill Seeker, we're moving into a Potency Conduit, then we move into Agent of Chaos. It makes it so Your Door of Shadows disorients the enemies around your target location for 6 seconds. Is a pretty good option for PvP, but it's just going to be what you're taking. There's not really any choices here because we're just going to be going for the potency conduit anyway. Then we have the finesse conduit. Then we have friends in low places. Everyone gets that. Then we have another endurance conduit, potency conduit, and then lastly, familiar predicaments. The duration of incoming interrupts, snares, roots, and effects are reduced by 25%. So with this talent tree, it's only about Thrill Seeker. The familiar predicaments, while it's going to be good in PvP, really doesn't have any inherent value in PvE. And that's kind of one of my biggest gripes with Venthyr as a whole, is it kind of feels like the Soulbinds after Thrill Seeker is just completely useless besides the potency conduits. So it's like, oh, the first thing that you get is really good. And then the rest of the expansion is just, oh, we're waiting for potency conduits. Oh, still waiting for potency conduits. Oh yeah, I have access to a potency conduit. And now I'm done with developing any more damage increase from the Soulbind specifically. Moving on from Venthyr, we're actually going to talk about some of the more mechanics in this system specifically, and then we're going to move into Night Fae after we get some of that knowledge. If you guys haven't already, I made a video about Renown specifically, going through some of the gated portions of it, talking about some of the unlocks, and then talking about the general timeline for it. In this video, we're going to be talking about some smaller portions of it, just to make it so you don't have to necessarily watch the video to understand what I'm talking about. But if you want a deeper explanation of it, I would suggest watching that video, link in the description. So a TLDW of that video is basically for Soulbinds, we aren't going to be unlocking them right away. There's going to be a linear progression and it's going to be gated by time. And how this works specifically is we're going to be getting a set amount of renown each week, and that renown is going to give us access to these actual unlocks here. And I think the biggest thing to point out here is I'm fairly positive that we actually don't get access to the third soulbind for any of the covenants until renown 27. And Renown 27 is going to take around like 2 to 2.5 months to even get to that point. So we're in a situation where a third of this system, and potentially the best soulbinds for some classes, they won't actually have access to until 2 months down the line. Now, I'm fairly positive that's how it's going to work. Based off of like the lore and everything, I think that's going to be it, because the quest lines that you're getting unlocked as you get higher renown are what gives you access to these soulbinds. It doesn't really make sense for them to give us access to a character in a story for a soulbind specifically before we actually are introduced to that character. And I think that's actually something that hasn't even been tested really, because from the beginning we've had max renown on beta. I'm fairly positive that's how it's been. If it's not, let me know in the comments. But I think that's how it's going to be. And with that being said, that means that they haven't actually tested the renown system to understand what these classes will feel like when we're hitting renown breakpoints. When some soulbinds have access to very powerful conduits that other soulbinds won't. So we're having situations where classes get access to their best soulbinds at the very start, but then other classes won't have access of their best soulbind until the very end, or at least until 2 months down the road. And originally this wasn't that much of an issue because the main PowerPoint that we were getting was at the very end. But in their recent changes with this, the main PowerPoint has been moved to the start. So the actual trade-off that you get for waiting longer is much, much worse. Because if we don't get access to the third soulbind until week 8 in the expansion, or potentially later, then we're just in a situation where some classes might just be worse because they don't get the same positive benefits from soulbinds that other classes will. And I really hope that it doesn't work the way that I think it's going to. However, everything is kind of pointing to that direction. So with that being said, we're going to start looking at the Night Fae. The Night Fae specifically, it's one of the most sought after soulbinds, but it's actually the third soulbind to be unlocked. So if the system works how I believe it will work, it's going to be 2 months before we actually get access to this soulbind. And that soulbind that I'm talking about is Kyrian. Kyrian gives us Wild Hunt Tactics, and this is by far one of the best soulbind abilities that we have access to. How it works is whenever you deal damage to a target above 75% health, your damage is increased by 10%. And then on top of that, you gain 15% movement speed for 5 seconds for the whole time of this actual situation. So for 25% of a fight, you're doing 10% increased damage. The main thing to think about here is we're going to be lusting on pull in most of the situations that we are playing in Shadowlands. Pugs will almost always lust on pull in most situations, so they don't have to worry about potentially people messing things up. And as a demon hunter, you're going to be meting every pull, so you're going to get a lot of benefit from this. This is just a flat 10% damage increase to the portion of the fight where we're going to be doing the most damage. Demon hunters specifically, if you just look at the damage charts, they're a 4-minute cooldown damage window. And that's unfortunately because of the poor design of the class, but how it just is. And then on top of that, when you have lust or heroism, it's just a best case scenario. However, when we look at what I just was talking about earlier with how the system potentially works, is we probably won't have access to this until 2 months down the line. So this is a major problem that we're going to have at the beginning of the expansion. But obviously, as we get later in the expansion and have Soulbinds completely unlocked, this will make it so we have access to everything. And realistically, I think this will end up being one of the best, if not the best, Soulbind abilities that we have access to. Moving on from that, we have a Potency Conduit. Then we have Horns of the Wild Hunt. Soul Shape increases your movement speed of your allies within 40 yards by 10 seconds. Moving on from there, we have a Finesse Conduit. And then we have another one of the situations where you can really choose either one of these. Then we have an Endurance Conduit, Potency Conduit, and then lastly we have Face Your Foes. When in front of a target, your spells and abilities decrease the damage they inflict on you by 3% for 2 seconds. This is one of those things that we probably won't really feel very much. However, when we start to think about like raid AoE situations, there could be some potential areas where this actually is helping a lot in just general damage mitigation. I think once we get later in the expansion, I actually have full access to all of the Soulbinds, Kyrian will end up being the go-to Soulbind for the Night Fame. Another interesting situation is actually the situation that we may find ourselves in the early portions of the expansion, just given on how powerful Potency Conduits actually are. With Nightface specifically, and with Dreamweaver, we actually get access to 2 Potency Conduits very early at Renown 13. This is potentially 3 weeks into the expansion that we're getting access to this. I'm not 100% sure on when these numbers will specifically time out to, if it's going to be 3 weeks or 4 weeks, but this is like 5 Renown ahead of most. So that's something very important to realize, is if there's a situation where Potency Conduits are just the best and it's just the damage increase between your Covenant abilities aren't that much of a trade-off, then this might be a good option to go early on in the expansion if you're trying to maximize optimal DPS at the very beginning. The main trade-off here is that the first ability that you get doesn't actually give you a damage increase, so that's something to really think about. This is going to be something that's going to give you access to a Potency Conduit the earliest, and it's the only Soulbind that gives you access to a Potency Conduit this early. There is a potential situation where it's just the best option. Then lastly, to round out the video here, we're going to talk about Nyjah, and lastly we're going to talk about Naya too. I think this is a situation where it could potentially end up being better than Pelagos over time with the first ability that we're getting. Grove Invigoration is that ability. It has 2 procs per minute, but the important part is to talk about the portion at the end. What it does is every time you deal damage, there's a chance to get a stack of Redirected Anima. Redirected Anima increases your maximum health by 1% and your mastery by 25 for 30 seconds. The stacks overlap. So what that last portion means is that these stacks do not combine, so they're just going to be ticking on their own. So you'll get 2 stacks every minute. In some situations, you'll have some overlapping of 2% hate or 2% maximum health and 50 mastery, which is just a slight mastery increase and a slight health increase throughout the majority of the fight. When you actually press your Covenant ability, you get 8 stacks of this. There could be a situation where you have 2 stacks already on you, your Covenant ability comes off of cooldown, and now you get 10 stacks of 25 mastery for the 30-second window. Realistically, those 2 stacks will probably fall off before that 30 seconds ends, but you'll still have 8 stacks of mastery for that time. So when we think about this versus Pelagos, obviously there's going to be slightly less mastery that you're getting, but the window that you're getting it for is realistically going to always be longer. So there could be situations where the actual trade-off from this and the reduced randomness from this is actually better than what we get from Pelagos. Since this is the first Soulbind, this is something that we're going to have at the very beginning of the game. Moving on from that, we have another potency conduit. And then we have a pretty good ability here as well, running without tiring. While in soul shape, you generate 5% of your maximum health every 3 seconds. Then we have a potency conduit. Then we have another one of the situations where you can choose either one of these. There's no drawbacks here. Then we have an endurance conduit. Then we have potency conduit again. And then lastly, we have Naya's tools poison. Whenever you interrupt something, you apply a dot to it. And then if you interrupt it again, it reticks the dot for a second time. And when we start to think about Demon Hunters specifically, we have access to interrupts a lot, and the likelihood that we're going to be interrupting a target multiple times in a 30-second window is relatively high. So this potentially could be a decent damage increase as well, on top of the mastery that we're gaining from the top of the tree. All right, well, this was a much longer video than I intended it to be, but I wanted to make sure that I went in depth on some of these specific systems so people didn't get into a situation where they expected to go one thing but didn't actually have access to that for 2 months down the line. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you didn't like the video, F5, refresh, try it again. Maybe you'll like it the second time. Have a good one.